Have these featured speakers, please feel free to read up on Tom, who is Tom Cronin, who is here today. As you know, he was not able to get in for yesterday's session, so we bumped into this session. I think these two papers will mesh well together. So it'll just be Tom and Al, and it looks like we've got a good body of folks coming in. First will be Tom, who will speak for no more than 20 minutes, but hopefully more like 15 minutes.
Okay.
And you can go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. I want to thank George Washington, Jim Burns, Doug Bradbourne, and Fred Smith for this opportunity for us to be here at this afternoon gathering. I have absolutely loved hearing last night and this morning's panels. I had the privilege of being a co-author with Jim Burns of a couple of his textbooks for nearly 4 decades. And just as you've heard from everyone else, he was a person who treated everybody generously, and he was a mentor to more people than I think any social scientist in America ever mentored in a whole variety of fields. And he adopted me when I was a junior political science scholar in the late 60s, and he was at the top of his field, and I was at the bottom of the field, and he made you feel as if you were a colleague. And he cared about you, and he cared about your ideas, and he wanted to be there for you when you were growing and coming of age as a young professional. I want to talk about a lot of Jim's ideas, and I have 15 minutes, and I have 15 ideas I want to share, and we'll see whether I get done. The Madisonian system, with its excessive fragmentation of power, Jim believed, might have been great for the late 18th century, early 19th century. But for the 20th and 21st century, it impeded the strategic exercise of power and progressive objectives. That, in a nutshell, whether we like it or not, Jim Burns argued, ours is a presidential government. It depends on a strong, effective president and presidency, just as a train depends on effective and strategic engineers and an engine. He was fond of saying that the cure for democracy is leadership. Responsible, committed, effective, and passionate leadership. This led him to become a stalwart advocate of institutional, party, election, and constitutional reforms. He would have loved to have been the delegate from Western Massachusetts to the Second Constitutional Convention. He was a walking constitutional reformist or convention unto himself. Among other things, he favored, as Susan suggested earlier, a single ballot, that we would elect the president and the House and the Senate together, so you would send a party to the national government, and so they could get things done, but to be held accountable by a strong opposition party, and he had great optimism in that. He also favored an item veto for presidents. He also favored abolishing the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, the 2-term limitation, which we briefly talked about this morning. He and I often argued about that. I'm an advocate of the 22nd Amendment for mayors, governors, and presidents, but not for legislators. Jim still felt that the 1947 passage by Congress, even though it was by 70%, was a slap in the face of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he, along with Arthur Schlesinger and most people from that generation who were supporters or fought in the war under Roosevelt, they felt the 22nd Amendment was horrible. And Jim always had debates with all of his mentees and colleagues, and there were always some issues like this. It was fun to talk with him about, but he was unapologetically an opponent of term limits. Also, the Electoral College. He was also a huge defender of caucus-based nomination systems as opposed to primaries, and he wasn't bothered by smoke-filled conventions and that kind of politicking. In fact, I think he wrote a New York Times magazine piece about 2 cheers for smoke-filled rooms or something to that effect. And but at the end of the day, he yearned. And as we heard the panelists say last night and this morning, He yearned for leaders who could be teachers. He loved the teaching presidents. And the teaching presidents were Washington, Jefferson, Wilson to some extent, Lincoln, and FDR. And John Kennedy maybe in a few months during the 1963 period. But he had an admiration. He didn't think they were without flaws. We never had a perfect leader. We never had perfect followers. We never had perfect structures. But he took his hat off to those who were teaching presidents. A one-paragraph summary of many of his writings on the presidency and Congress and parties went like this, and I'm paraphrasing from him in a way, but he, one way or another, repeated this over and over again to me. Jim Burns would say, "We need Hamiltonian energy in the presidency and in the White House in order to make our many splendored and many splintered and overly fragmented Madisonian system of checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism work in such a way as to advance Jeffersonian and Rooseveltian ends of liberty, freedom, and social justice." That's a one-paragraph summary. For those of you who haven't read his 30 books, let me read it one more time. This one paragraph. We need Hamiltonian energy in the presidency in order to make our Madisonian system of many splendid, many splintered, fragmented checks and balances and separations and so on work in such a way as we as a people can achieve Jeffersonian and he would add Rooseveltian ends of liberty, equality, and social justice. He explained to us in a variety of his writings how hard and exacting it is to provide political and especially progressive leadership in a nation that so celebrates individualism, liberty, and rights over obligations, responsibility, and communitarian objectives. And this gets back to the discussions of Roosevelt, Jefferson, and Washington we had earlier. He reminded us, too, that there's great merit to the ingenuity of what the framers did, but that we would honor the framers best if we could think like them and reframe the challenges that faced us now and into the future and could come up with structures and parties and election systems that spoke to the next 200 years rather than live off of the intellectual capital that they so wonderfully provided, but that some time had elapsed and things had changed and challenges had changed. There's a story about Lyndon Johnson, and Al will relate to this because Al has just written a wonderful book about presidents and civil rights and race. There's a story about Lyndon Johnson when he became president in 1963. His advisors came to him and said, you only get so much political capital, and there's this big civil rights issue. We think you ought to postpone that. And they urged Johnson not to press for civil rights in his first speech after he became president, because there was a little chance they felt of passage, and the president shouldn't waste his power on lost causes, or no matter how worthy the cause might be. The presidency has only a certain amount of coinage, his aides were saying it to him. Johnson's response was, well, what the hell is the presidency for? Well, what the hell is the presidency for? And I think Jim would have liked that. And I think Jim applauded the Lincolns and the FDRs and the Johnsons and others who embraced conflict and recognized conflict, but recognized that leaders had the responsibility not to just be a weather vane, not just to seek out popularity and fame, but also to teach and to lead. One of the great paradoxes of American leadership and paradoxes of leadership in any organization is we ask a leader to listen and to follow, but also to lead and to teach. And that's really the nub of leadership, is how you reconcile that. And maybe the times dictate when you got to move out and when you embody conflict and recognize it. And as Johnson would go on to say the very next month or week, we have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. And he said, now is the time. And Jim Burns also was terrific at explaining to us that leadership is a compound, and I'm sure Dick talked about this yesterday afternoon when I was trapped in the Chicago airport, that leadership is always a compound of leaders, followers, and context. And you can't separate the one from the other two. Leaders, followers, and context. It's a chemistry, it's an engagement, and each thing influences each other. Leaders are followers so much of the time, and followers become leaders, and it's a chemistry. And Susan, just an hour ago or so, quoted FDR talking to Sam Roseman in the White House one time, said, "It's a troubling thing to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead and to find no one is there." And that's what Roosevelt lamented. Every leader, we've all been in a situation, even with our kids. It's a little bit like, I like the little story, the metaphor of the group leader who temporarily gets people excited about climbing Mount Greylock, just to take one of Jim's favorite hills. The people are rallied and excited, saying, let's do it, we're with you, we're in, as the youngsters say these days, we're in. But halfway up Mount Greylock, the group leader turns around and finds nobody's following. The question for leadership scholars is this person a leader, or is the person merely taking a hike? And we know the answer. This person is merely taking a hike. So again, that's central to the notion that now, I'd love to talk about his writings on Washington, Lincoln, and all the presidents. I'm just going to talk about two, on Roosevelt and Kennedy, that have intrigued me over the years. He admired Franklin Roosevelt a great deal. Roosevelt was a divisive leader as well as being a united leader. We look back at him in retrospect. But as you all know, Roosevelt was often hated, and Jim captures this when he said a lot of his nicknames among people was Franklin Deficit Roosevelt, among other things. But in crucial, and the courts hated him, and Southern leadership hated him oftentimes, and isolationists hated him. He was a person, for 13 years who was a leader in very tumultuous times. And Jim Burns admired him, but he also never allowed a leader to go to escape the microscope of analysis. And he said, on balance, FDR was a reluctant liberal. He favored some tax reforms and redistribution, but like all democratic reformers, he feared the label of being an anti-capitalist or an egalitarian, or worse yet, a communist. And Jim Burns, when he ran for Congress in 1958 in the 1st District of Massachusetts, was called both an atheist and a communist at almost the height or around the height of the McCarthy era. And Jim knew how that stung him in his primary and in his general election of 1958. Jim knew all about that. Jim's a tough evaluator. He said, FDR, unfortunately, failed to carry through the one strategy that was politically most feasible and economically the soundest for a depressed economy, and that would have been a broad fiscal planning encompassing monetary investment, pricing, interest rates, and public works and welfare policies, and a strategy based not on occasional pump priming, but on the heavy and continuous deficit spending, that kind of a Keynesian or economic stimulus in Obama times that went fueled, that had to wait until the war economy to really pull the country out of depression. So he's tough on him. And he said FDR was a principled leader and an idealist crusading for spacious goals and coherent vision, yet also, this is backing up what Susan and others said earlier, also he was a Machiavellian manager focused on narrow, short-range goals often, carefully husbanding his power and popularity in a world and a nation of shifting moods. He often manipulated, dissimulated, horse-traded. We use the word horse-trader a lot. I had a student in my class a couple years ago, and she came from Kansas, from a family that their business was horse trading. She didn't like that word. It's a common term in political science, and that we engage a certain amount of horse trading. She said, horse trading, that's what we do. I'm always a little bit cautious about using that phrase. His greatest moral failure, Jim Burns says, was his inaction in the face of the Holocaust. Retrospectively, Jim says the ultimate crime against humanity. In this ultimate crime against humanity, the president never sought to display the consistent and compelling moral leadership that would break through the bureaucracy and the legislative resistance or the ignorance, and that this country should have acted. This is very much like in Susan and Jim's book on George Washington. At the last chapter, at the end, there's a little raising the concern that Jim and Susan had about slavery and particularly political competition, political liberty, and that it's the tail end of a wonderful book. On JFK, very briefly, Jim Burns wrote about Kennedy. Senator Kennedy, President Kennedy, wrote grandly of courage and leadership, but was usually practical, cautious, and concerned with being shrewd. Jim Burns was not a member of the Camelot school of JFK glorification, and he wrote as his kind of verdict in the long and broader judgment of history, his friend and campaign colleague will be seen as a politician. John F. Kennedy will be seen as a politician of extraordinary personal qualities who rhetorically summoned the American people to a moment of activism and greatness, but who fell back on conventional politics of brokerage, manipulation, and consensus once he attained office, who found the institutional constraints on action, especially in Congress, far more formidable than he had expected, who was intellectually too much committed to existing institutions to attempt to unfreeze them, and lacked the passionate moral commitment necessary to try to transcend these restraints. And then in his third year, and only in his third year, did John F. Kennedy begin to find his compass, his true direction, and make moral and political commitments to it. In essence, Burns is saying he wants effective, strong presidential leadership who adhere to those Jeffersonian, Wilsonian, Rooseveltian ends, and who can get things done. And those of us who watch popular culture, House of Cards, know that Kevin Spacey, President Frank Underwood, is the most popular president in the United States right now. He might transcend the three that Arthur mentioned earlier. Because why does the average person say they like Frank Underwood? Because he gets things done. But he throws people under the bus, and he's manipulative, and his ends and means are quite confusing, and so on. My time is running out. I can see by my watch. I wanted to talk a little bit about Jim's notions of leadership, and so important, the engagement and how the best of leaders, like Washington, as Arthur talked about earlier, the best of leaders are constantly empowering potential leaders that are around them and bring out the best. And I think that was Jim's quality. He wasn't a political leader, but as an intellectual leader, he was constantly bringing out the best of dozens of political scientists, dozens of leadership students, dozens of people in political psychology and history. And it's very rare in America now that scholars, people of many fields, and can be broken field runners, or in the old days, football players used to play both offense and defense. Jim was somebody who transcended the silos in a way that inspired so many of us to sometimes branch out beyond our more narrow discipline. And that's what he thought leaders were. The best of leaders were people who could bring out people from different ideologies and different parties and work together, develop. And politics is all about coalition building and agreement building. And Washington was the reason we honor him so much in this precinct here is because he was ultimately an agreement builder. And at a crucial time, two crucial times that this country yearned for and needed agreement building. I'll close by saying In 1986, Jim gave the commencement speech at Williams College. And I want to quote that. But prior to doing that, I just want to share one other factoid. One of my best friends and colleagues at Colorado College, Bob Levy, was a student of Jim's in 1954. And 61 years ago this spring, Jim came into class one morning in Griffin Hall on the Williams College campus and said to his class about this size, said, we're not going to talk today about what was in the assigned readings. Instead, we're going to talk about an important case the United States Supreme Court handed down this morning. It was Brown versus the Board of Education. And Jim seized upon that. My friend, 61 years later, he's in his 80s now, student of Jim's in Griffin Hall, he remembers that class vividly because Jim Burns said, this is an important case. This will change America. This is something we've been waiting for. Brown versus the Board of Education. It's that kind of teaching. Jim said in his commencement speech at Williams College in 1986, he lamented America's over-infatuation with the practical and the pragmatic, and spoke, if only briefly, that morning on behalf of dreamers, idealists, and even utopians. And he had a fondness for dreamers, reformers, and utopians. And he said, and I quote, and I'll close, in my view, pragmatism is often a code word for timidity, opportunism, moral compromise, and often a mask for expediency, evasion, and the rationalization for greed and ambition. Thank you.
We had decided that Tom was going to go first and I would go second. I now regret that. I'm sorry to have to follow that great presentation. Let me say it's a terrific honor to be here, to be at Mount Vernon, to be part of this celebration of James MacGregor Burns and George Washington. I really want to thank Brad Byrne and Sean Thomas and others who put together a wonderful conference. Let me begin by on a personal note, if I may, and I think I mentioned last night that I first encountered the name James MacGregor Burns when I was in high school. I bought a paperback book in South Station, John Kennedy, A Political Profile by James MacGregor Burns. And 10 years later, I ended up at Williams College in the psychology department. And if there ever was a case of a person being at the right, a psychologist being at the right place at the right time in terms of Jim Burns, that was it. I summoned up the courage to call the great man shortly after I arrived, and he came to one of my classes where I was actually talking about presidential leadership within a psychology class, and he talked to me in the class about James David Barber and Fred Greenstein, two psychologically minded political scientists, and that was just a wonderful introduction to what a liberal arts college could be and how interdisciplinarity could happen. And then one day, a year or so later, he showed up at my office on a sunny afternoon, I remember, in the fall, and he said, do you have a minute? Yes. And he talked about his project to develop a book on leadership, to move beyond talking about leaders, but to talk about leadership itself. And then he felt he needed to expand his theoretical and disciplinary boundaries, and especially psychology. And since he knew I, as a psychologist, was interested in leadership, could I tell him anything about human motivation? And I remember saying, well, do you know the work of Abraham Maslow? And he had not, and we went out to the card catalog. I'll remember it very, I remember very vividly. Jim writes about it like this. I said, soon I was sitting in his office and hearing of work in his field, including that of a psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who had developed a striking theory of human wants and needs that held fascinating potential for understanding leadership and change. I remember standing there talking to him about Maslow's hierarchy and pyramid, that you have physiological needs, and then if those are satisfied, people become concerned with safety needs, and then on to love and belongingness needs if those are satisfied, and then esteem needs, and finally at the pinnacle, self-actualization, although there have been several different versions and modifications of that theory. And as Jim writes there, and I'm sure this is a perfect example of reconstructive memory, but I could just see him, the idea that motives, one motive could be satisfied and then another one could be engaged. And I like to feel, and he sort of says it there, that right there was the idea of transforming leadership, that leader could serve to gratify followers' motives and therefore change those motives and move them up to engaging toward higher levels of motivation and morality, which is key to his definition of transforming leadership. So this conference is about remembering James MacGregor Burns, and I remember that. And I like to think of somehow having a conversation with Jim now. Either I would get a 15-minute pass to where he is. I think that's unlikely on a lot of grounds, or maybe he could come down and talk to us, or maybe I could get a 15-minute phone card or something like that. And what I would want to talk to him about is some recent conceptions of human motivation. And I just like to talk about those. Imagine I'm talking to Jim about them. I don't have any conclusions, but I would wonder what he would make of them and what you might make of them. First of all, Maslow's hierarchy is very controversial within psychology. There have been lots of criticisms and modifications. One interesting one by some evolutionarily oriented social psychologists says, the first three levels are fine: physiological, safety, love, belongingness. But let's expand esteem to esteem and status, because then that leads to the next stage, or set of stages, which is not self-actualization, but mate attraction, mate retention, and parenting. Okay? From an evolutionary perspective, you want to pass on your genes, and there's really no particular value or a particularly powerful human need for self-actualization. And as I thought about that and thought about leadership and what motives leaders appeal to, I would also suggest that we dump self-actualization and that we really focus on esteem needs, but I would expand the idea of esteem needs for significance and value. That's what people want. That's maybe the most important need that leaders can appeal to. And I'm reminded of what Joanne was talking about early, just respect for human values as a moral criterion for judging adulterous behavior. Actually, there are many, many examples of this. One example that appeals to me is in the wonderful historical novel, The Killer Angels, about the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a wonderful scene where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain addresses the troops and tries to get the 2nd Maine guys to join the 20th Maine guys. And he's talking about what the war is all about. He says, ultimately, it's about the idea that you and I both have value. And I think leaders appeal to that in important ways. Let me mention 2 and 3, if I have time, departures on human motivation that I think Jim might have been interested in. One is something called terror management theory, which was slow in getting published in the 1990s, since many reviewers simply did not believe the theory or the data supporting it. However, since the theory has made its breakthrough in journals, it's been very powerful. It's inspired by actually ideas by the anthropologist Ernest Becker, who says that human beings share with other animals a survival instinct, but that we are the only species that are aware that that survival instinct is going to come to naught because we are mortal. And we fear that is a terror. But there's some anxiety buffers that protect us from our fear of just being rotting flesh, as the terror management theorists talk about it. One is that we bolster our self-esteem, make ourselves feel like we really are significant. And secondly, we bolster our worldview. That is our philosophy, our in-group, our country, our leaders, our symbols, so that we can feel that we are part of something, an important part of something great. And it's interesting, the range of things that happen in psychology experiments where people are made aware of their mortality, which usually happens by asking people to write an essay or write for 5 minutes about, imagine what's going to happen to you when you die. What's going to happen physically to you when you die. And there are unconscious processes which lead to fascinating results, more pro-social behavior, more intergroup hostility, more preference for charismatic leaders. So it's a powerful motive. What I think underlines terror management theory is the idea that if we feel insignificant, that we don't have value, we just are rotting flesh, that is terrifying, and then if leaders can appeal to that, make us scared to death, as happened in the campaign of 2004, that will allow us to, that will enable charismatic leaders to move us. So if we take the idea that leaders can appeal to our need to have value, and I think you can see that both within and between groups. And one of the most interesting approaches to seeing this operate within groups is a line of research on something called procedural justice, which suggests that if leaders or authorities want to get voluntary compliance, it's not so much what they give to their followers in terms of distributive justice or outcomes, but whether procedures are fair, whether decisions are made in a fair way. And if people are given what is called standing, that is, they're treated with some dignity, their rights and views are respected, if authorities can be trusted, they seem to be ethical in the second stage of Jim's ladder of ethics and values, and if they're neutral, if they're unbiased, make decisions in that way, it will be perceived to be a procedurally just decision. And when authorities make decisions pertaining to you in a procedurally just way, that signals to you that you have value, that the group values you, the leader as a representative of the group. And if you feel that you have value in the group, you will feel that the leader has legitimacy, a psychological state, and if the leader has legitimacy, you will voluntarily comply. I would love to talk to Jim about these notions. And finally, there's some new work by a psychologist who for many years was at UVA and is now at NYU, Jonathan Haidt, who's written a book called The Righteous Mind that many of you may have heard of. And he talks about 5 or sometimes 6 evolutionarily based values. And these are caring and fairness and authority and loyalty and sanctity. And the different ways that different leaders appeal to these basic values, it can be articulated in many ways. He said inheritance is just the first draft of our values, and then it's shaped by culture. And he talks about the conservative advantage, because liberals seem to focus almost exclusively on caring and fairness, and conservatives on all 5. Let me just give you one example of that illustrates Haidt's argument that our reactions in terms of our values and moral judgments, have a non-rational but instinctive quality to them. And I'm going to get back to what you diverted us from this morning. I was talking about sex. Julie and Mark, who are sister and brother, are traveling together in France. They are both on summer vacation from college. One night they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie is already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret between them, which makes them feel even closer to each other. So what do you think about this? Was it wrong for them to have sex? And then there's a transcript of people saying, yeah, it's wrong. Well, why? Well, incest is wrong. Well, why is it wrong? Well, you might produce a deformed child. Well, they're not going to get pregnant, et cetera, et cetera. What it illustrates is a basic point that Haidt argues with a metaphor of the elephant and the rider. The elephant is our instinctual, inherited, moral sense. The rider exists to help the elephant and to do much more rationalizing about values than really looking at them rationally, which raises all kinds of interesting questions about how you change values and moral perspectives that are so rooted in irrationality and evolution. I'll stop there.
That's great. Well, two more wonderful pieces. Gentlemen, why don't you take a crack at each other before we open it up to the general audience. Washington didn't have an elephant, he had a camel on occasion. Maybe we can squeeze that in.
Could I comment on Tom's comments about Burns and JFK, because it is so interesting, and I actually mentioned this at Jim's graveside ceremony in July. I've always been fascinated by Jim's ambivalence in his approach to the Kennedys. And in 1983, Jim and I and a sociology professor and an economics professor organized an evening called Remembering Kennedy, Implications for the 80s. And Jim urged us to be really tough and really critical of Kennedy. And he was the anchor person. He went last. And we were all dutiful. I thought we were quite objective and analytical and non-sentimental. And then Jim began in that mode as well, but then he switched from head to heart. And he read a Yeats poem. I wish I could recover exactly what it was that brought us all to tears, which showed his love for John F. Kennedy. And I've just seen that ambivalence in not only toward John Kennedy, but toward Edward Kennedy. And it's just a fascinating, reveals to me a fascinating pair of two facets, not the two, but two facets of James MacGregor Burns and the way he thought about leaders and leadership.
Good comment. I think it was a question of the heart and the head. His heart, he was a Kennedy Democrat in terms of the rhetoric that Kennedy talked about. His favorite Kennedy was Teddy, no doubt about it. He kind of had a professional political respect for John F. Kennedy. He didn't have a good relationship with Bobby Kennedy. There was a cold relationship. But Teddy Kennedy adopted Jim early and vice versa. And Teddy would, I was at Jim's Bee Hill Road house one day when Jack Peltison and I were working on the Government by the People, a revision of our textbook. And Teddy Kennedy just calls up and said, "Can I come over for dinner?" He was in town campaigning for an election. And Teddy and several of his aides just came in. And that happened regularly during Jim's career. And Jim wrote a campaign biography of sorts about Teddy. We didn't mention that book because that book never was put in service of an election. But he was very fond of Teddy because Teddy seemed to be closer to Rooseveltian ideas or Jeffersonian ideas, and Teddy was more of a fighter willing to embrace conflict. Now, had he become president, he would have been more like Roosevelt and Kennedy. But just a few comments on that. I think the relationship with John Kennedy was, even though they campaigned together and talked together and visited together, I think it was a professionally cool relationship. With Bobby, I think it was even colder. And with Teddy, it was a very warm relationship where I think both of them acknowledged a strong friendship. I don't know whether that resonates with you.
It does.
Yeah.
If I could just reminisce a bit, the first time I actually saw James MacGregor Burns was in early September of 1970 when I just started at Williams College, and Ted Kennedy was running for re-election to the Senate. This is a year after Chappaquiddick. Is he going to make it or not? And Kennedy gave his speech, and then this tall, good-looking man stood up and asked questions, and I just remember it so well because the head and the heart. The questions were tough. He went right after Kennedy, but you could just tell there was warmth and affection and admiration there. And I just remember saying, that has to be James MacGregor Burns.
The irony is that Teddy was occupying the seat that Jim really would have loved to have had.
Yes.
We've heard that story already.
Why don't we open it up then for the rest of the group? Now, remember, we have microphones so we can hear everybody. Who wants to take a crack at either of these two? Motivation, presidential power, amending the Constitution.
Tom, at the end of your presentation, you made some provocative statements about pragmatism, which garnered me a severe hush from one of our attendees because I was really excited about that. So my apologies for talking while the next speaker was beginning. I've been studying the pragmatists, and particularly Dewey, and I was telling my colleague here that I didn't even know about Dewey other than by name until I went to Europe, and a young doctoral student heard me mention Dewey, and she said, I love John Dewey. He's Danish. And she's doing her doctoral research around applying pragmatism to organizational leadership, and it was really exciting, and it was very surprising to hear a young European excited about the American pragmatists. So my question has to do with, I didn't write the quote down, but the visionaries and
Utopian.
Dreamers and utopians.
the utopians, how far can they get without confronting the pragmatic implications of their visions?
Great question. Influenced in part by Jim Burns, many years ago I developed a kind of a typology of political leadership. And borrowing from Chekhov, the great Russian playwright, who said, if you see a gun on the wall, it's likely to go off in Act 3, so watch that gun. I think in politics and in leadership movements, we fail to remember that there are people in Act 1 who are stir-uppers, troublemakers, utopians, dreamers. They couldn't care less about whether they get reelected or whether they're popular or about their fame. They're interested in the truth or in justice or anti-government or whatever, you know, and they're the John Browns at Harper's Ferries, and they're radicals, and they're people who are willing to be in sit-ins and do what they think is necessary. Chain themselves in the early women's movement to the White House fence because they couldn't vote. They're not interested in getting elected. They want, but Act 2 people are movement organizers. They're the Martin Kings. They're the people who take ideas but develop them into movements or go to court litigation or to broaden the agenda. And Act 3 people, in my typology, are kind of power brokers, elected officials, party officials, and people who necessarily, by our rules of the game, have to concern themselves with pluralities and majorities. And you can operate, Jim Burns, I think, often wanted presidents to be all three, to be Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 leaders in a sense. He wished in a way that the transformational person was a person with, in transformational leadership theory is essentially a moral vision. It's a moral ideal, an idealism, and a lot of the heart and the mind, and focused on these big objective ends of liberty, equality, communitarianism, the common good that we kicked around this morning. And so in the practical world, it is difficult to operate in Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 simultaneously. All of us have, I believe, some Act 1, and Act 2, and Act 3 in us. But in our professional lives, we tend to become very good in one act or a few scenes and so on. And so I don't, there's no rigidity to my typology, but does that make sense? So, yeah. So the more you are over to the scene 3, Act 3, you're going to be more pragmatic and more concerned with consensus and agreement building and building support around, whether it's the League of Nations or Obamacare or tax reform or whatever. And in Act 1, you just want to do what's right. You don't care about the rest of the tribe. You're going to throw yourself into some movement, and because it's the right thing. And it might be Ayn Rand's movement, or it might be the civil rights movement, or global warming movement, or whatever. Does that make sense? Jim tried to get at some of these ideas, by the way, in his majestic 3-volume History of America, in which he tries to move away from the great man theory or the Green Lantern theory of national Spider-Man, leading us, the almost chosen people, to the almost promised land, and trying to celebrate cadres of leaders and grassroots leaders and so on. I think if he had lived, he would work more on that, on the notion that we're too often swayed or overwhelmed by singular leaders, and we like the movie Spielberg's movie on Lincoln, a wonderful movie, wonderful acting, but at the end of the day, we get the impression, falsely, that Lincoln was, for 20 years, the champion of the 13th Amendment, and for 20 years was in favor of emancipation, and that's just not the case. He was, just like Obama and other politicians say, I'm evolving on this issue of same-sex marriage or whatever the issue is. Lincoln was a slow, gradual evolution, and he was predominantly an Act 3 Whig politician, an Act 3 Republican politician who he was never an abolitionist. And he was never, and he joined the 13th Amendment crusade only a few months before that movie begins. And so Hollywood and a lot of the storytelling in America has a bias towards the heroic savior figure. And Jim succumbed to that occasionally, but he tried to teach us to be cautious about that, too. And
Can you flesh out the typology between your Act 1 and Act 2 a little more? Because you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm wondering if you would put the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Act 2, or I'm wondering the characteristics,
Right.
not so much of 3, but there seems to be kind of a shady line between 1 and 2, and I'm wondering where 1 kind of morphs into 2, and
good question. I don't have a good answer. I've written several things about it. I can give you some citations later. But an Act 1 person in the civil rights movement might have been Nat Turner, John Brown, or Malcolm X. And whereas some of these things we read about in the movie Selma were in Act 2 categories, if you will. And then Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy were in Act 3. I happened to be an intern in Washington in the summer of 1963, working for a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, not Teddy Kennedy, actually, Leverett Saltonstall. And an amazing event happened in 2 days. This is August 1963. Many of the interns, hundreds of us, were invited by John F. Kennedy to the White House on August 27th, 1963. We were all 20 years old, or 21, 22. And John Kennedy had us to the back garden, not the Rose Garden, because it's not big enough, but the back lawn of the White House, for punch and cookies and a pep talk about getting involved in public life and how we, we're all 20-something, had our obligation. It was John Kennedy at his best, talking about how we need to be involved, and he hoped we would go back to our colleges and our universities and get involved in civic life and so on. And we all raised our punch glass to President Kennedy, stole a few extra cookies, and were pumped up and went away. The next day, virtually every intern there, along with 300,000 Americans, marched from Capitol Hill by the White House. And the Kennedy brothers had hoped and tried very hard to suppress that march. And it was the march that religious leaders and labor leaders and Martin Luther King Jr., among many other, we didn't think of it as the Martin Luther King Jr. March, by the way. It was a religious labor movement event in which there were many speakers and many great singers and poets and so on. We think now about it because of Hollywood notions of simplification. We think of it as the Martin Luther King March. And he gave a historic, legendary, iconic speech that day. But we marched that day against the Kennedy brothers, as well as the Congress. Oh, we were 20. We didn't have to stand for election. I called my parents in Massachusetts, and they thought I was a radical. They urged me not to do it. And my U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, Leverett Saltonstall, three-time governor, three-time senator from Massachusetts, he was wholly against it too. But every intern in his office, from Wellesley, from Smith, and me, and he called me into the office a couple of days before the march, and he said, because most of the other interns were women from Wellesley and Smith, or Mount Holyoke, he said, Tom, would you march with them? And, he was all against this, but he wanted me to look after them and care for them. So it was very quaint for this old Yankee to, their attitude was, these are Act One and Act Two. They're rebellious. And so I don't know whether that helps, but I know when I'm an Act One person, an Act Two person, an Act Three person. As a college president for 13 years, I had to mostly operate and navigate in Act Three because I had boards of trustees and mayors and donors and foundations and faculty committees and so on. But at other times, I marched against 4 presidents in my youth. So occasionally when students might march against me as a college president, I was very understanding.
Ed Larson.
I'm very quickly ask, your comment you just said tied into that, in passing, just very briefly in passing. No one has really talked about religious motivation. Jim Burns didn't talk much about religious motivation, and yet we seem to be in a world filled with religious motivation, whether it's American politicians like Sam Brownback or people over the Middle East or different places in Israel. What do you see as a role of religious motivation today, or you just dismiss it as an illusion?
That's got to be for Al, right?
Let me get Al first.
Well, religious motivations is obviously terribly, terribly important, and I'm tempted to think about how it relates to the 5 values that Haidt talks about: loyalty, authority, sanctity. All of these values can be expressed in numerous ways as shaped by the culture, and the religious expressions of them are very, very powerful because they, I think, tie into the really strong motivations of value and significance. I mean, when people wrap their motivations and their political convictions into something that they really feel is of spiritual transcendent value, that makes it very, very important. And we had best understand that. And of course, the way it's changed is so interesting. I think Rick Santorum talked about being sick to his stomach reading what John F. Kennedy said in Houston in 1960 about the total separation of church and state. And one of Kennedy's most wonderful quips at a press conference in 1962, I think, shortly after the decision banning school prayer. And I think the question came a little bit loaded with the fact that he was a Roman Catholic, and therefore, what did he think about that? And his response was wonderful. I thought he said, there are many Supreme Court decisions that we may not agree with, but it's part of our system to obey them, and that's the direction he pointed. But he said in this case, there's a very easy solution. People should pray at home before they go to school, and maybe the society would be better off if people took their spirituality a little more seriously. So I think understanding religious feelings and motivations, even though you're right, Jim didn't talk about that very much, is absolutely critical in understanding what people's motives are and how they can be appealed to by a range of leaders.
I don't have a good answer for that question, but it's interesting how many of the early settlers in America came here because of religion. They were escaping from religious oppression elsewhere, and so to come here was so crucial to be able to have that kind of freedom. And then it's interesting when we wrote the Bill of Rights that there'll be no establishment. I was talking with one of my mentors recently about this. The clause in the First Amendment that there should be no established religion. Really. But the reason why that was done was because many of the states had in fact established, and they didn't want. But they didn't want to have it nationalized, and only an early American historian would realize that the degree to which that was becoming enforced and how the framers wanted to transcend that in a sense, and that's fascinating. Roe versus Wade divided the country religiously in a powerful way, and to some extent, some of the polarization that we have is religious-based in America today, stemming from that decision, which Harry Blackman authored, who lived just up the road from here in Alexandria. And he had bricks thrown through his window, and he was vilified by a lot of people, and a lot of constitutional law scholars don't know exactly where he got the legitimacy for coming up with that decision. But that decision, what year was that decision? 73? Something like that? That changed the landscape of American politics in many ways. And in my state of Colorado, I write books on Colorado politics from time to time, and in Colorado right now, there is no correlation between income and party identification, income and party voting. When I was growing up in Massachusetts, not too far from Al, the bankers, the lawyers, the wealthy people, the country club people were all Republicans. And the children of immigrants and working class and labor people were all Democrats. And there was a clear kind of, Massachusetts politics was kind of clear. And ethnicity overlapped and reinforced that. In the state of Colorado now, if you really dig into it a little bit, what church you go to and some of your religious views on social issues are more defining than income and wealth, which is the generation that you and I grew up in. And it's fascinating. And I don't think we totally understand how this is playing out. But obviously issues of Roe versus Wade, same-sex marriage, and a variety of other issues. Some of it is prayer in school. Some of it gets confusing. It's hard to exactly know about this, but this is a powerful underpinning, and I think we saw that in the Republican primaries 4 years ago. Those issues arose, and they'll arise again. One interesting thing is that one of the 2 or 3 major leaders in the Republican primary race right now, if he announces he he hasn't announced yet, is Jeb Bush. And Jeb Bush converted to Catholicism 20 years ago, his wife's faith, which very few people know. But it's conceivable that the second Catholic president of the United States will be a Bush, which is intriguing in seeing how that plays out. And but probably the fact that he's married to a Hispanic and fluent in Spanish and a Catholic makes him a different kind of Republican and may broaden his base, although he's in for a very tough set of caucuses and primaries where some of the people on the opposition to Roe versus Wade still carry the flag for a lot of those religious issues.
Let me mention one essay that I would strongly recommend that deals with motivation, religion, transforming, and transactional leadership. And it's by Nick Warner, who's a literature professor at Claremont McKenna University. And there's a marvelous discussion of Captain Ahab's leadership in Moby Dick.
It's a great piece.
And his ability to play on both transactional and transforming leadership, and just had a good sense of how far emotional, charismatic, transforming leadership could take people if sort of lower needs aren't satisfied. And Ahab is...
He was a transformational leader who led us to disaster.
Yeah.
So
and we were facing all
beware.
kinds of questions about the...
Beware of transformational people.
Ahab is anti-religious, satanic, but also religious quality. I mean, the marvelous quotes in there. I would strike the sun if it insulted me, and pushing through the pasteboard mask and telling telling Starbuck, he says, well, what are the owners going to say? You have to go a little bit deeper than that, Starbuck, to really get to the fundamental religious, spiritual values which Ahab persuades the crew that he represents. It's an absolutely marvelous essay that I think really clarifies some of Jim's fundamental notions of transforming transactional and human motivation.
Over here in the back. The title? Of the essay?
Citation.
Gods and Common. It's in Joanne Chula's 2008 book published by Prager called Leadership in the Humanities. The author is Nick Warner.
Yeah, right here, Gil. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
When you mentioned value, that got me thinking, because I think when you said if given a standing, if trusted, and if neutral, that signals that you have value. I'll put it out there right now. I have a personal relationship with the Lord, so therefore my comments probably will be biased, but I'll try and keep them neutral and objective for this forum. But what I would say to that is the elephant in the, if the elephant is to support the rider, I consider myself the rider, then the Lord being my support, okay? So from that, we already have that ingrained for those of us who believe that. We already have that as part of who we are. So basically, what I take from that is I'm building from that. So if I'm building from that, what does that mean? And in my dissertation, when it came to value and building a valuable solution over just creating something of value for sustainability purposes, there were a couple things that were interesting. It was listening, improvement, and then what value to generate the outcome of uncertainty and failure, how that is influenced by that. So you can, with listening, of course, there's words spoken, or you can actually hear what is being said. The improvement then is just knowledge that there's this need for improvement, or personally taking it on and saying, what can I do then to personally improve to make this better? That is when the distinction between providing something of value to offering a valuable solution emerges. When you have a valuable solution that you're giving to others, you're lowering their levels of uncertainty, and you're lowering their levels of failure. Creating something of value, being that it's not grounded in something that everyone shares or needs, where I feel spirituality for sure, underlying whether we acknowledge it or not, does have a role, really articulates what that is. So for me as a believer, the valuable solution then is we're already given a purpose, we're already given our plan, and we're already given our place. what it becomes for us then is figuring out what that is, using our gifts and talents to do that, and constantly being led so that we can help lead others. And so that ability to be open to learning, even though I might not want to, might not know how, may not even see it, but just that objectivity of I'm willing to do whatever I need to do if this is where I'm being led, because I'm trusting here that this is in alignment with what's happening and I know all my options. And then finally, just another comment to your terror management theory. It was funny because I was defending my dissertation, and my one professor, Dr. Stone, I don't know if you know him from Regent, but he said, oh, it sounds like your thing is identifying entrepreneurial terror. And I hadn't ever heard that term before. And so I understand how you can get in that place. It's what do we do then to lower those levels of uncertainty, lower those levels of failure, and really get people to move forward then either together or individually. That was just my comment.
I don't know if there's a question there. What you said sounds very, very wise to me. One thing it makes me think about in terms of terror and psychological defenses and helping people is Ronald Heifetz's work on managing and stress and helping people clarify their values and face reality and therefore figure out a way to proceed. Leaders and followers working together to solve the problems that their values define for them. And that sounds like it fits quite well with what you're saying, and I think it's also very Burnsian in many ways.
Gail.
Al, I wanted to go back to your motivation theories and rotting flesh and the
it's awful, isn't it?
And all of that. And I've been a big critic of the hierarchy of needs, but there was something in between the fear and the person that I think Maslow was trying to describe that's worth thinking about a little bit more. As I understand it, Maslow actually studied 80 people or something to that effect, and one was Eleanor Roosevelt. And so even though I'm not a total proponent of this theory, I'm thinking about what was it about those 80 people that he was really trying to say. I mean, is there the rotting flesh theory versus somebody who's really comfortable in their own skin, and how are they motivated differently from somebody that's searching, from somebody who's has, to Maslow's terms, lower level motivations or whatever? Wasn't he trying to say something different about that kind of person, and how is that useful?
Yes, he felt that people like Eleanor Roosevelt, one of his favorite examples of a self-actualized person, has fully developed all of her potentials. She has been all that she can be, and that has, and I think this is very consistent with Jim, has a moral component to it, that not everybody reaches self-actualization, just like in Lawrence Kohlberg's theory, which also very much influenced Jim. Not everybody makes it to a post-conventional level of morality. Maslow emphasized how rare those people are, and maybe it's the highest form of human development. And I don't dismiss it as a real phenomenon at all, and in an interesting category. I feel like I've been doing this all day, sort of dragging us down to more fundamental base considerations, and realize, to think about what most leaders and in most situations where they do and probably can move people. And I think it's at the level of making them feel that they have significance. And maybe self-actualized people can do that better than others, although when you look at Captain Ahab or Adolf Hitler, people Jim would not consider to be leaders, but nevertheless appeal to motives that and moralities that people felt. That doesn't sound like a very coherent answer, Gil, but it's my answer. So it's the best I can do to try to address that.
Did Burns move away from Maslow eventually? I mean, was he ready for all the latest new theories? Or
I think he would have been, and I regret that we didn't have those conversations, because I think he would have been fascinated by some of the implications, sinister, of terror management theory. I think he would have liked procedural justice theory. I think he would have been fascinated by Haidt's ideas about what basic values are, that seem to have some hereditary evolutionary basis, and how do those work.
we got time for one more exchange. Let's do it. Right in the back. Yes, go ahead.
Quick question, and putting your hat on for the future. We have a presidential election coming up that's already started. What do you think Dr. Burns might suggest would be the three most salient issues that we're going to be facing as a democracy in 2016, regardless of who the presidential candidate would be? Got a lot of knowledge about presidents here, so.
I think peace and inequality. I think he would be very concerned about how many skirmishes and civil wars and the Middle East situation, Yemen, and I think he would love to see our leadership, not singular, the president, but leadership institutions, working around the world to lessen the strife around the world. And then a major theme of his later in his life was poverty and inequality. And I think that he would, he cared deeply about that. He tried some initiatives along the way to talk, and this country and around the world is becoming more stratified in terms of wealth. And ironically, the Chinese have actually brought more people out of poverty than any people in the world into its middle class, and they're kind of they have a political system that we don't like. Although, one anecdote, Jim and I were part of an intellectual delegation traveling in China in the late 80s, and we were at Chou En-lai's home university, Nankai University in Titian, for a week, and in which we were living in dorms with mostly cold water in our showers, I remember. And Jim was always a good soldier about that kind of thing. But it just occurred to me, I was talking to Michael Beschloss last night, that Jim preached strong party, strong leaders, and we should fight inequality. And these are things the Chinese they've overdosed in terms of authoritarian centralized leadership. And, they have a strong party, but unfortunately only one. but they may be, around the world, one of the countries working on the inequality issue in a way. What's a fascination to us is they've merged capitalism with their one-party authoritarianism, and maybe they're kind of taking the cue from Lee Kuan Yew, the fascinating Singapore leader who's just died, who turned around that little fragile island into an economic tiger and one of the highest GDPs in the world and so on. And we don't like the fact that he suppressed political liberties, but he obviously looked at his context, and he developed a form of leadership that Jim probably would have admired up to a point. And but the irony of our talking about, or Jim maybe talking in China about, strong Hamiltonian leadership from the top, and strong parties, and it was a little bit like carrying coal to West Virginia, if you will, in a way. I don't recall exactly what we said there, but I just imagining, we were mostly talking about the American presidency. We were the guest of the Chinese American Studies Association, which we didn't know existed. One of the things that came out of that meeting was our textbook, Government by the People, which preaches civil liberties and bills of rights and second bills of rights and competitive elections, was translated by some of those scholars there into Chinese and published by the Chinese Communist Press in Beijing. And that was incredible. That was like 1990 or something, to have a book that celebrates constitutional democracy and constitutionalism. And we were very honored by that. They didn't pay any royalties, but we were honored nonetheless.
Al, this election?
Well, I was going to say inequality, number one, and I was also going to mention immigration, but I think actually not so much that, but picking up what Tom said about war and about what we've been talking about in terms of religious motivation, and Susan may know something about what Jim's views on jihadism and ISIS and what that implies for his theory and his thinking about transforming moral, as felt by actors, leadership. It's you very. I think it would be very provocative in him, theoretically and politically.
As you know, Jim's last book was called Fire and Light, How Enlightenment Transformed Our World. He believed in enlightenment values, especially in human reason. I tell my students that for me, the most important 3 words in all the Federalist Papers are Hamilton's Federalist number 1, when he says this government is the product of reflection and choice. I can only think that Jim would have contempt for anything reflecting theocracy.
Right.
And these anti-pre-modern, primitive, anti-enlightenment, and theocratic values.
Right.
I think another subject Jim might be interested in is the Supreme Court and money taking over politics in the country.
Citizens United and things.
And he voted,
Yep.
as you know,
Yep.
Court
court.
Well, let's continue the conversations after this break and give a round of applause for these two excellent gentlemen. We went a little long, so we'll start at 3:04 because it's the last session coming up next, and it won't get in any way of anything except for the drinks.
Okay, great.
I want all your citations. I want to read it.
That's great.
I know that book, which became a bestseller, but I haven't read it. But you made me. The Height.
Nick, Jonathan, I've got a copy of it right there.
Al, you're on for the next one.